Hi everybody, and welcome to today's virtual session. If you've seen some of these before, my name is Emma Morrissey, and I do several of these tutorials in lots of different themes and several mediums as well, from pencil to watercolour. And I'm really excited to bring you a botanical based one today for Creative Wellness Journey. I hope you enjoy it. All you're going to need is some sketch paper of some description and some colouring pencils. They can be any brand. And the first thing I'm going to do is just show you a little bit about how to get the very most out of the pencils you've got. Obviously, if you've got a art specific brand, Daler Rowney or Winsor & Newton, then some of these art brands have quite a good degree of pigment in the pencils. If you've got something a little bit more of a introductory in terms of pencils, you can still do a lot with them, even if they are a little bit on the more basic quality. So I'll talk you through that as we go along. This is the image, so I'll make sure you have the link to this so that you can follow along with me. And as I always explain, there's a few different ways that you can attempt to do your version of this when we're using a reference photo like this. The first one is if you have access to a printer and you'd like to print it out, then by all means print it out, and then once you've got it printed, if you imagine sort of it's here and this is the printed side, flip it over, put sort of a HB pencil over the back, flip it back over, and then you can effectively trace it onto your sketch paper so that you'll have a replica. Something else that I've done is I've made sure that you've also got a link to something called a grid system, and what that does is when you get the link to this image, you then need to save it, and then when you go to the grid system website, you can just upload the photo, and then it will create a series of squares, and then you will be able to put everything in each individual little box, and sometimes that can be quite good for people as well. But for myself at the moment, I'm going to show you how you can sketch it by eye, so by all means you can do that along with me if you would like to. For those of you who would like to try that out and do a basic sketch by eye before we get to colour. But as I said, you've also got those other options where you can print it out if you have access to a printer, put some pencil on the back of it and then take a tracing of it, or use the grid system website. Okay, so the very first thing I want to do is just get my pencil, and I'm going to do a very, very basic sketch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start over here and I'm going to do clockwork. Okay, so if you want to start with the outside, you can, but I would recommend starting in the center and then sort of working your way in a spiral. Okay, so we're going to look right at the very, very center. I'm hoping my camera will focus. Okay, so I'm just going to focus in the center here, and I'm just doing very basic sketchy lines because obviously we're going to be colouring this in a moment. Obviously take your time with this. Obviously I'm doing mine quite quickly just for the purpose of today's tutorial. But it just gives me a basic outline of where everything is, where it all needs to be, and obviously you can make corrections, alterations if you need to. And if you find you've got something in the wrong place or you've got something extra, don't worry about it. That is all part of your artwork. Okay. So that's going to be my very, very basic sketch. I'll hold it up so you can hopefully see just a very, very basic outline. Okay. And one of the things I always recommend is having a look at all of the different colours you can see in this. So if I move my pencil tin here for a moment, have a look at all the different tones you can see and see if you can match them up. Okay, so I can see I've got sort of a orange, sort of an orangey red. There's a bit of this orange in the center here, and just hold it up to the photo, whether you've got it printed out or if you're sketching it from your phone like I am. Just have a look at all the different colours and just try and match them. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is very quickly I want to show you how you can make colour pencils work best for you. Okay, so when you're working with a ordinary sort of a graded pencil, like an HB pencil like this, or if you're using a coloured pencil, the same basis applies. So if you hold it far down near the tip, you can apply more pressure. If you go backwards and forwards, you can get a nice, smooth, quite vibrant amount of colour. And if you hold it halfway along like this, you'll see the colour becomes much lighter, even if you go over it several times like this. If you hold it up near the very, very end, of course, you've got very, very little control now, so it will be very, very light. Okay. Now this is very important when it comes to things like mark making. You can also do sort of circular motions like this when you're shading and blending. And you can see it's not quite as intense as the first mark I made when I was going backwards and forwards, up and down, because I've gone in a circular motion here. It's much easier to put another colour over the top. Blends quite nicely. Okay, so just have a little experiment with that. And then what we're going to do is go in to our drawing. Okay, so I'm going to start in the middle. I'll see if I can zoom this in a little bit. And it's just a case of following it round like we did when we did sort of the sketch of it. And to start with, what I'm doing is I'm putting in all of the darkest, most sort of obvious colours in here. Now I'm pressing quite hard, but in a moment you'll see that I'll go a little bit softer because I'm going to start blending. So this is just going to give me a basic idea of where everything is. So now I'm just going to go a little bit softer, a little bit lighter. Again, this is just going to be a sort of a basic sketch, botanical sketch, basic study. I'm going in a circular motion. What this does is this helps break down the pigment of the pencil. It's quite helpful to do this when you're sort of doing shading of any sort as well. Something else which is worth noting is the sort of paper you're working on. Now I'm working on mixed media paper, and mixed media paper works very well for lots of different mediums, whether you're using paint or whether you're using pencil. But if you're using sort of a more general sketch paper, that will be fine. What you'll find with sketch paper is the texture of it will be very different, whereas if you were using something like printer paper, it's much smoother. It's not ideal for drawing on, but you can do sort of pen drawings on that quite well. Okay, so at the moment I'm just working my way around and I'm darting my gaze backwards and forwards all the time. In the early stages when you're building something like this, you'll also see that it takes quite a while before you see everything start to come together. And that's part of the creative process, is just sort of seeing it magically appear before your eyes. Okay, so I'm going to press a little bit lighter now. So we can see here we've got this sort of shading. It's very, very subtle and very gentle compared to this very, very vivid, bright on the edges of the petals. Now, it's going to be really challenging, I think, for anyone to recreate that identically, because obviously this is going to be different no matter how many times you do this, whether you're doing this sort of drawing base, painting base. I'm just going to incorporate another colour now, just for the middle. But as I said, you'll notice it will be different each time, because obviously everybody's going to approach this differently, everybody's going to see it slightly differently. And for the purposes of this, we just want to, you know, try and be as creative as possible and just get ideas flowing. And that's the beautiful thing about this, is we want it to be a relaxing process. So I've got a little bit of a light grey now, because we can see there's some shading here. So I'm going to go in with my circular motion again, and I'm just going to start to build that in. So as I said, have a look at the different colours you have. If you don't have all the colours and all the tones, don't worry. You can absolutely just use a couple for this, just a orange where you sort of press quite lightly, and a red. Okay, so I'm just going to keep building this up very slowly, a bit at a time. Sometimes what you might also notice is if you take a break from something and then go back to it, you'll see things you may have missed the first time you looked at it. And I think that's effectively because you're sort of taking a break and then you're going back to it, so you're looking at it with fresher eyes again. And that can make a huge difference when you're sort of being creative and trying out new things. And for something like this, it's all about experimenting. Everyone's going to be slightly different. Everybody's going to have a slightly different take on it. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm effectively going over some of the lines that I did earlier, just to make them a little bit crisper. I'm just adding in some more sort of depth, being a bit more specific with some of these marks that I'm making. And the more you do this, the more confident you'll become. Probably see I'm applying quite a bit of pressure. Again, I'm holding this right down the end of the pencil. As I said, don't worry if you end up sort of drawing extra petals, or you've got a few less than you can actually see there. Don't worry about that. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my sort of orangey red here, and I'm going to just start to put a bit more of a shade around here, a little bit more. And I want a little bit more of a sort of slightly darker grey, so I'm just going to go in with a slightly darker one here, just to capture the shade that's under here. And you'll see I'm doing this sort of circular motion. And this goes up here onto the petal above, so I'm just going to try and capture that a little bit if I can. And move to the lighter grey over here. I'm going to start to put a little bit of some greens in here as well, just underneath. I think this is going to lift everything a bit. And I'm going to start off with a lighter green, even though it's a darker green underneath here, because often when you start lighter, obviously it's easier to then make it darker as you go. If you end up going in too dark, then of course you can't lighten it as easily. So I'm going to put in a very, very sort of sketchy green in the background here. Now you'll notice I'm flourishing my wrist quite a lot now because I want to cover a larger area. So experiment with that as well. And you'll notice I'm sort of holding it here, but I've got a fair amount of control here, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And if you hold it firmly and you go backwards and forwards, it helps you get that equal display of colour. Otherwise, sometimes when you're sketching, you can have an area which is a little bit darker, a bit that's too light. I'll show you what I mean if we go over here for a minute. Sometimes you can have that sort of thing where it starts off a little bit darker and then it pans off a little bit lighter. Now that's great if that's the effect you want, but if you want to keep it equal, you've got to keep that pressure there as you go backwards and forwards so that it's all one tone. Okay, so I'm going to look at the other greens I've got here. I'm just going to start to build this up a little bit. I've got a bit here which I want to be a little bit lighter. Keep building it up. You can sort of go backwards and forwards. You can go in opposite directions as well. That helps break up the what they call the paper tooth, and basically that is just the texture of the paper that you're working on. Okay, I'm just going to keep building this up. Go with a different blue here. Green, sorry. Although it does look like it's getting a slightly bluish tinge here, which is quite interesting. There we go. I'm going to go over this again with the grey. This is quite a lot of shade here. It's a very dark green, so I'm not going to go in with black because that's a little bit too intense. We can see it's not black, it's a dark green. So I'm going to go over the greens I've done with grey because that's just going to deepen and darken it that much more. Same for the stem. Okay. I'm just going to start to put in a few little bits here and there, just to make it sort of pop a little bit more. So you want to be constantly, as I've said before, darting your gaze backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. See what you can add. Okay, so I'm just going to keep building this up a little bit. Nearly done. Sometimes if you do want to use something quite intense like a black, you can use it in the very minimalist of ways, just a little bit here and there. What that does is it really can make a difference, make things pop just a little bit. You don't want to overdo it though, because black is a very definite colour. It's very unforgiving. So when I use it, especially for something delicate like a flower, I use it very sparingly. Okay, obviously you can get away with it more on areas that are shade. I'm just going to move this just so I can focus a little bit more. As I said, areas that are shaded you can get away with using a little bit more of it, but again you don't want to overdo it because, as I said, it is very unforgiving. Just a little bit here and there. Less is more. Okay. You can see it does lift it quite a lot, just a little amount here and there. And this is just a really good sort of quick introduction to get you understanding how to use colour pencils, just to give something different a go, especially for this time of year now. So do something botanical is always a lovely idea. Okay. So I hope you found this helpful, and hopefully I will see you soon for another virtual tutorial.